my long experience of running Q&A, a couple things tend to work. Number one, make sure you're asking a question. Number two, keep it brief and to the point so as many people can ask their questions as possible. And number three, to remember that we're all here interacting as Christians, and so gracious conversation is what should drive us. So just come up to the mic if you have a question, wherever the mics are. There they are, okay. Yeah. Okay, so we're over here. So stand up and speak up.
Sorry, I don't know how to use technology. So with the idea of identity and how God breathes in spirit in that way, and that we were not made from dust, but is the dust from the ground, what are ways that we can keep that from going to just a spiritual realm and Gnosticism?
Mm-hmm. Good. Again, it's certainly not a statement that we're not physical beings. We are physical, material beings, but the question is, what part of the story are they telling? And if they're trying to identify who we are. We have plenty of other places in the Bible that say we're dust. Psalm 104, remember that we are dust. Dust you are, and to dust you shall return. And even Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. And they ought not to be accused of Gnosticism just because they're talking about identity there. So I think it's just a matter of recognizing our task to try to identify what is it that they're addressing. Thank you. Yes?
Thank you for your lecture, Dr. Walton. You said that you do not believe the early chapters of Genesis are making scientific claims. Are there places in Scripture where you believe the text isn't necessarily making scientific claims in the modern sense, but is making claims that perhaps run perpendicular to the claims of science, where there's a crossover where both science and the Bible would say things that might either be in conflict or in correspondence?
Certainly they are constantly making comments that reflect their views of the world around them. And if we want to call that science, but it's an ancient science, it's the familiar science. So the question I was trying to address is not whether they ever address a scientific world. They do all the time. But is the Bible, through those authors, making truth claims about the scientific world? So for instance, if we see that the biblical authors are pretty persuaded of a solid sky, does that mean the Bible is making a truth claim that everyone who believes God must believe that there's a solid sky? And that's that difference, the difference between reference, referring to the world as they know it, and affirmation, what is the truth claim that's being made. And I would say that in all areas of science, they're not making truth claims, but they are referring to the world as they understand it. Again, a lot more about that in the next session.
Hi, Dr. Walton.
Hello.
So during your lecture, you said that rest is the goal of creation, and you spoke of rest as having control over an ordered system. And you also mentioned that it doesn't necessarily equate with taking naps, per se. And I'm just curious to hear your take on that, you to elaborate more on that, because we talk a lot about Sabbath, and speaking of it as rest. And so I'm just curious to hear your take on how we should practice Sabbath in light of how you described it.
Thank you, thank you. I always leave that out of the presentation because I know someone will ask it. And I didn't tell her to do that. Yeah, I think that with this understanding of God's rest to be equated with his rule, it gives us a lot of reason to rethink what Sabbath is all about. We've often thought that in Sabbath we are to imitate God. He rested, we rest. But of course, if his rest is his rule, then it shouldn't be he rules, we rule. Okay, so we have to change that paradigm a little bit. Instead of imitation, what I have found works a lot better for what I see in the biblical text is participation. That is, when we participate in the rest of God, it means that we stop thinking that we order our own world and our own lives. Stop thinking that we're in charge, and recognize that God is the one who orders the world, who orders our lives. And so Sabbath is to say, step out of your own, I'm doing it myself mentality, and step into this is God's world. And to acknowledge that and to recognize it. I think we definitely get that view in Isaiah 58, 13 and 14, where it kind of reflects on what the Sabbath is all about. So when we observe Sabbath, we recognize his rule and his reign, and that he is the one who orders our life. Your kingdom come, not mine. Your will be done, not mine. And so our rest is the same thing that Jesus offers in Matthew 11. Rest in kingdom identity and kingdom participation. So thank you.
Dr. Walton, it's fitting you talked about Genesis 1 and 2. In one of our classes recently, we were discerning if God's immanence and transcendence can be discerned from Genesis 1 and 2. And so these things aren't mutually exclusive, but for clarity's sake, can you talk about theological rivers and how they may converge or the risks associated with those things?
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, theology is part of our cultural river. It's part of their cultural river. And I think there's a lot of benefit to be gained from trying to understand the theological currents in their cultural river, if I can say it that way. And of course, we have our own theological currents in our cultural river, and eventually we want to try to see how those two might be connected. Sometimes it's difficult to bring our theological categories to the biblical text. Labeling is everything. Anybody in marketing knows this. Labeling is everything. And the minute we label something, even if we label God, we categorize, we classify, and risk mislabeling. So certainly we can talk about some of the theological concepts that we have and ask how they might be reflected in the Old Testament. But even then, we have to be careful that we don't impose a category on the Old Testament. Certainly, from my own beliefs about transcendence and immanence, I can see both of those in Genesis 1. The fact that he is creator is in itself a transcendent category, and the fact that he wants to be with us is the immanence. So to that extent, I think that it draws those things together. I don't know if I answered your question. I hope I did. Yeah.
Going back to the identity question from a slightly different angle, you contrasted identity with Adam and Eve versus kind of scientific genetic questions. But in particular, in the person of Christ, in the biblical narrative, our identity with Christ in the flesh is very important, and in particular the human flesh, not just that he assumed a bodily nature, but human bodily nature. And it would seem like that would then include, as science expands, that would include all aspects that we recognize scientifically as aspects of human nature, including genetics and DNA. And so I was wondering if you make any distinction or where you would make any distinction between our identity with Christ in human flesh, including genetics, versus with Adam and Eve.
This is really pushing me out of my specialty areas, but I don't want to dodge the question. Certainly, I think we identify with him in every way. The text seems to suggest that that identity is comprehensive. But certainly, likewise, the text wasn't thinking about genetics. So the minute we start discussing genetics, we're now on our own, because the text hasn't given us that kind of orientation. And I always try to be real careful about that. I don't want to try to make statements from the text that are based on a modern understanding of the world, even if we were very convinced that it's a proper and correct understanding of the modern world. So there may be many, many different ways in which we are supposed to identify with Christ. But I don't know that I would be able to try to flesh that out any further. Come on, work with me. I'm here till Thursday. No. Okay. So it's a great question, but I'd have to do some more thinking about it.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Walton. The title of the talk said that there was some conflict between science and Christianity or faith. But when I guess the context of the talk, I kind of felt like you were creating a separation rather than an integration. Mm-hmm. And the reason I ask this is the implications for how the church approaches it in discussions and so forth. And I'm just curious on your opinion on that.
Yeah. I think the church has to be engaged in both conversations. It just has to realize how the conversations are different from one another. I don't think that science and the Bible should never have any interaction or integration. I just think that we have to tread carefully so that we recognize what the Bible's doing and what science is doing. I don't think, I'm of the Stephen Gould NOMA approach of non-overlapping magisteria, because I think that we can talk about compatibility and we can talk about the way that both reflect the realities of our world and of our belief. And I think that's different from what Gould would have thought. Maybe someone else can correct me on all of that, but at any rate, my title was Our Accountability When the Worlds Collide. But I'm suggesting they don't collide near as often as we might think. And my accountability is clear in terms of the biblical text, but I don't feel like I need to make that choice between science and the biblical text. And I think that's what causes the problem today so much. So many kids growing up in the church are told, it's a war and you've got to choose. You can't have both science and the Bible. You have to choose. And unfortunately, many of them get to college and they find out how persuasive science is, and they say, well, I was told I have to choose. I guess I have to choose, and I choose science, and next thing you know, they've lost their faith. So I'm trying to address that, among many other things, by saying, let's look carefully at the Bible, how it works, what it's saying, and what it's not saying. And maybe that can help us to find out that we don't have to make that choice. And again, I'm encroaching on my next hour's talk, where we'll be talking about the war. And next hour, the war is over.
Thanks for your comments on agency and mechanism. I wonder if you have any thoughts on how that extends beyond the Old Testament to the New Testament, as we think about, for example, stories of demon possession and so on that we really wrestle with, about what is the way in which agency is expressed there, and what should we or not take in terms of mechanism and science in that regard. Is that a clear question?
I think so. I'm not sure I can answer all of it, but first of all, my most recent book is called Demons and Spirits in Biblical Theology. And I did it with my son, and we examined every passage that either deals with demons or Satan, or some people think deals with demons or Satan, to try to sort out the biblical theology issues, not the phenomenology issues. In terms of agency, I think the texts are pretty clear that God's agency extends to all of those situations. He is acclaimed by the demons as being the Lord. He is feared by them, and they make their petitions before him. So to that extent, I think that it very clearly puts him in the position of agency. What the Bible doesn't do is that it doesn't suggest it's the same level of agency everywhere. The Hebrew term asa, which we often translate do or make, is a term that expresses agency. Either in actions or doing things or making things, it expresses agency. But when you look at its 2,500 or so occurrences, you find that it clicks in at different places in agency everywhere. So any different level of agency can all be expressed by asa, because it doesn't care what level it is. It's not Aristotle. He's not sorting out levels of agency. So to that extent, The Bible doesn't try to resolve except to say that Jesus is Lord, and that the demons fear him and they obey him, and etc. But that's because he's the Lord of order. As creator and sustainer, God, Jesus is the Lord of order, and many of the stories in the Gospels seek to demonstrate that. And the encounters with demons is the same as his encounter with the storm. Those kinds of ideas of God's control over the world, bringing order, establishing order, maintaining order. And I think that's the direction those stories are heading.
You and I talked about this a moment after your lecture, but I think some might benefit from hearing the answer from you, and that is the distinction between science and scientism.
Yeah.
And by scientism, I mean the belief that science can explain everything. It may not have yet, but it will someday. Right. Another term for that would be naturalism.
Right.
And so maybe if you made that distinction, it might help some students and others.
Sure. First of all, scientists may think that science can explain everything and therefore you don't need a God. But in that, they're drawing metaphysical conclusions, not scientific conclusions, and they've ceased talking about science. That needs to be recognized. Secondly, even if science could explain everything, that wouldn't rule out God's agency. In the ancient world, as I'm going to talk about next hour, there's no category of natural or supernatural. And therefore, God's involved in everything. And he's just as much involved in everything that we call natural as he is in the things that we recognize as highly unusual. God's agency is pervasive. And so in that sense, it wouldn't matter if science could explain everything. It wouldn't matter if you could give a natural explanation for all the 10 plagues. God did them. And the natural explanation wouldn't change that fact. So that comes into our categories and our labeling, our classifications, and we'll discuss that in the workshop. But that gives a basic gist of it.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm wondering if you could speak more to the idea of the cosmos as a sacred space and the implications of that for how we walk through the world in our lives, and especially how we understand sin.
Mm-hmm. I think it has a great impact on that, and the fact that our interpretation of creation as a house story, the fact that we've done that, has caused us to lose lots of that powerful theology. When I first wrote about this in my Genesis commentary, and even in Genesis 1, The Lost World of Genesis 1, I talked about the cosmos as a temple. And the point I was trying to get across was that it was sacred space. And that's actually better wording than to call it a temple. With a temple, there's an inside and an outside. If the whole cosmos is a temple, then there's no outside, and that raises questions. So it's better to talk about it as sacred space. And space is sacred because God's there. God's presence makes it sacred. And so if the whole Genesis story, the home story of Genesis 1, is about God making a home for himself to dwell with us, then it makes it very clear it's his world. Again, to go back to the bed and breakfast idea, when you're a guest at a bed and breakfast, you don't just trash the place, right? Okay, you don't just trash the place because it belongs to somebody else. And so you honor and respect the person whose place it is. And so I think that does greatly affect how we think about our place in the world and our role in the world. So that the sacred space idea gives us a theology that is going to demand that we think in terms of how we take care of this world. But my colleague, Dr. Mu, will be addressing that as we go through the conference.
Again, question. Thank you, first of all, John, for very rich and wonderful lecture. I wonder how, if you could help us a little bit decouple the whole issue of agency when we talk about science for most people who are not living in the academic world, and for students that become pastors, they have to deal with normal folk. You hear scientists claim there is no agent, which of course is different from raw science. They can't claim that, but they still do. And so how do you help students kind of negotiate that? And I think it carries further maybe into the question asked by Angela a minute ago, when you talk about agency and mechanism. What are the demons? Are they agents, or is that just mechanism? Another way of explaining, say, epilepsy.
Yeah. So, first of all, agency and mechanism, certainly there are scientists who draw metaphysical conclusions. They can say science cannot detect agency, and since they are locked in a thing that the only reality is what science can detect, they will therefore say there is no agent. But that is not a scientific conclusion. It's a metaphysical conclusion. So science does not say there is none. It's just science is not designed to be able to detect one. That scientists occasionally, maybe often, decide there is no agent, that's a metaphysical theological conclusion, not a result, because their science can't prove there is none. You can't prove a negative very easily. Okay, so to that extent, do we have to be careful to recognize when scientists are moving over the line from science to metaphysics, and call them on it. So in terms of demons, that was the second part of your question. Demons, as I understand it, are part of the non-ordered world, not the disordered world. Now, I have to explain that quickly. We often think of the world in two parts, good and evil, moral categories. That's our cultural river. It can be useful, but it can be a hindrance, as most things in the cultural river. And so we tend to work in those two, a bipartite way of classifying what we experience and phenomena that are around us. I've become more convinced that in the ancient world and in the Old Testament, they have more of a tripartite way of thinking. They think of non-order, which is not evil, it's just lacking order, has not been brought into the ordered world as yet. Then there's order, which is the act of God in creating to bring order. And then there's disorder, when something or someone works against the order that someone else is trying to set up. Okay, these are not moral categories. It's the non-order, order, and disorder. Order is not the normal. It has to be established and maintained. Without being established and maintained, it will drift back to non-order. And that's why we see God as creator and sustainer, continuing to maintain order in the world. Things that are sin, that work against God's order, of course, fit in the disorder category. When we think of something like a tornado or a hurricane, natural disasters, they fit in the non-order category. That represents a non-ordered world. In the ancient world, the Egyptians thought about the ocean and the desert as the realms of non-order. In the Hebrew Bible, tohu vavohu, formless and void, Genesis 1:2, expresses non-order. It's the before picture, before God ordered. Currently, my wife and I are in the middle of moving. And so we're out of the old house, and the new house is filled with boxes. The world of non-order. It's just because we haven't ordered it yet. The boxes aren't evil, at least most of the time I think that. But they're non-order until we unpack them and put things where they belong and put them in a functioning, role and purpose ordered system. They are not yet in the world of existence. I like to think of them as non-existent, but at any rate, so demons are part of the non-ordered world. As Jesus encounters them, and as they hardly ever show up in the Old Testament. The Old Testament, interestingly enough, has no established demonology, even though clearly the Babylonians and Assyrians and Canaanites had a very extensive demonology. It's a very fascinating thing. It's in the book. Anyway, but Jesus encounters demons, and it's his work with the world of non-order. And he brings order, whether it's the demoniacs or whether it's this or that act of oppression, or when you get to the pigs off the cliff. I mean, all of those can be addressed in those terms, and that's what we do in our book. We go through all of those. So I would see demons not as active agents. It's almost they're working by instinct, not by agency. I mean, just like a tornado doesn't have its own agency. It has instincts, so to speak. And likewise, demons, and therefore they're not in the ordered world and need to be brought into the ordered world. God created order. That's what it means when it said it was good. It was ordered, ready to function, but he does not fully order the world because he tells people to step alongside of him as his image and subdue and rule. We know there's an outside the garden which is less ordered than the inside of the garden. And we know that ultimate order does not get accomplished until new creation, which is, in my mind, not a return to Eden, but going where no man has gone before. Oh, that's Star Wars. Okay. Anyway, but so this idea of God's order, and so that's kind of how I fit demons into that. But there's a lot more to it.
Thank you for your lecture.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just curious, with the idea of formed humanity, dust of the ground, how does that fit into creation care? Or, like, I suppose, is there a way for you to expound on that a little bit more to other areas that it touches within theology, whether eschatology and risen bodies and redeemed creation, as well as creation care?
Each one of those is a book. So, the creation care element comes most forcefully out of Genesis 1, not out of Genesis 2. The subdue and rule and those kinds of issues, the image of God, are the ones that speak, I think, more plainly to our role in the world. Adam and Eve, I believe that they are placed in the garden as priests, and that's a different sort of care and order bringing. So to that extent, I'm not sure that from the dust, or not from the dust, makes that difference. Certainly, the dust identity has theological ramifications, particularly the question of death before the fall. And that's the big one. How does that all work? Because if they're from dust, and dust means mortality, then from the beginning, God has given them the identity of mortality. And of course, that makes a certain amount of sense, because in the garden there is a tree of life, which is largely useless if you're immortal. So the idea that there's a tree of life suggests they were mortal, but that God had provided the possibility of an antidote, a remedy. And when Paul says that we are subject to death because of sin, he's not saying you were previously immortal. He's saying rather that you had an antidote, but you forfeited it when you sinned, lost access to the tree of life, which is very clear from Genesis 3, and therefore you are now subject to death because of sin. No antidote. So I think those theological issues can be worked out, but of course they have their issues. Sin and salvation is still something I'm pretty traditional on. Except for the idea of death before the fall, perhaps, but the idea of sin came at a point in time that we're all subject to it and that we need a Savior. My theology is in pretty traditional shape with that one. I do mostly text analysis. I do the Hebrew text, I do Old Testament, I do Ancient Near East, and my training is not theology, and my specialty is not theology. So while I'm doing text analysis, I look for others to try to fill in the theology questions. And a new book has just come out, which I think does that extremely well. It's by a Dutch theologian named Gijsbert van den Brink, and it's called Reformed Theology and Evolutionary Theory. He's a theologian, and so he starts to take all of the things that I and others have done in text analysis and hermeneutics and bring it to the theological questions. It's an important aspect. I think we're out of time. I believe we can handle one more.
Thank you. And again, thank you for all your insights. It's a quick question, but I think it's pretty deep. So maybe we can, hopefully I'll be able to come back for the workshop and we can pick this up. I have a pretty limited intellect, and so a lot of things I hear and I'm not certain about. But I'm coming from science background. I'm a science guy, and so if we're honest, when we're doing science, we have to embrace uncertainty. I mean, I'm uncertain about a lot. So I just, maybe if you could real quickly talk about how we want to be certain of things on our faith. We're taught to be certain that we are saved, that Christ loves us. I mean, we seek certainty. Then you have, I think it was Peter Enns that wrote a book called The Sin of Certainty. So on the other hand, you can go too far. Where do you find that balance? And how have you found that balance in searching and trying to be certain, but yet saying, you know, I'm human, and there's so much that we just have to say, I'm not certain, I don't know.
That's a great question. You know, 15 years ago, there were things I felt pretty certain about that I don't believe now. And to me, that's really important. If I ever get to the point where I can't open up my Bible and have it change my mind, I'm not in a good place. So I think certainty should have its limited shelf life. And we ought to be cautious about that. Yet, we are supposed to feel security in Christ. And that's kind of a different thing, but maybe not too different, I don't know. But there are things that we are uncertain about, and not just in science. You know, we talk about the many paradoxes of theology, and it's true. You know, there's a book came out 2 years ago maybe called Paradox Lost, and clever, isn't it? I mean, I wish I thought of titles like that, but Paradox Lost, and talks about a number of these paradoxes in theology. And they've always been there, and we recognize them. And that means that in our humility, we ought to recognize that we don't have all the loose ends tied up. And to me, that means I'm open to change my mind if the evidence comes up a little differently, if I see something differently. To some extent, that's become quite evident as I've written 3 books with my son. I find out all the places I've been wrong. And, so, I mean, that's a great exercise. But it's something that I think has to be true in the classroom as well. I always want to hear the insights that my students have and the observations, even if they undermine a position that I just presented. To me, that's part and parcel of our life as Christians, to be learning and to be open-minded and to hope that we can get it better next time. And so that's the faithful interpretation piece.